All right, silica is the one that we've kind of just recently realized is killing everybody, and the one that is recently in the news a lot. Countertop manufacturers are highly susceptible to silica if they're not using proper PPE because there's a lot of cutting and grinding that happens with these countertop materials, and some of them contain really high amounts of silica. Silica is basically sand, and when we drill into rocks or cut rocks or grind rocks that contain silica, we release crystalline silica dust, and that can get trapped in our lungs, and it can cause silicosis, which is an irreversible, incurable disease. The latest statistics I have are 46,000 deaths worldwide in 2013. I think those numbers are going to go up quite a bit as soon as I get some newer data on that. But one thing that they've also kind of recently discovered is a lot of these cases with coal miners that they thought was black lung disease is actually silicosis. They're cutting into or grinding into rocks trying to get to different coal veins, and there's a ton of, or they're highly, contain high levels of silica, and that dust is released when rocks are cut or drilled or ground, and people are breathing that in. And this picture just kills me. Somebody dry cutting concrete and just billowing dust all over the place. No respiratory protection, anything like that. Blew me away. Some of the work that was going on at CR, they were doing the same thing, dry cutting a bunch of concrete, and there was just a cloud of dust over the entire campus. And I thought that was pretty out of line. OSHA, as of 2019, I believe, was the year of silica, essentially. There were new regulations put out at the beginning of the year limiting exposure, requiring testing of silica exposure, and they were out in force, looking for stuff like this. So here's a little chart that can give you an idea of some of the effects of silica exposure, but one interesting thing is bluish skin at the earlobes or lips is a sign of silica exposure. And what ends up happening is you just totally lose your lung function, and people can't even barely walk from one end of the room to the other. It kind of acts similarly to asbestos, which we haven't talked about, but I think people understand that a little more than silicosis. But the dust lodges itself in your lungs, and it creates scar tissue, and then eventually your lungs just become a piece of scar tissue, and they cease to function as lungs anymore. So when we're dealing with silica, we want to do what this guy's doing, which is wear respiratory protection. We always want to wet cut or vacuum anytime we're cutting concrete or rocks or drilling or anything like that. We want to be, the thing that the water does is it prevents dust from blowing all over the place. It makes like a sludge instead, which isn't really that big of a deal. It keeps the dust down. Or we can vacuum it as we're cutting. We can vacuum all that dust up. And then the biggest thing, and the thing that they're starting to do now, is limiting exposure. Okay, making sure that employees aren't doing more than a certain period of time being exposed to silica. So mining and construction occupations, they're monitoring that a lot more closely. And this isn't one of those things that you drill into a piece of concrete once and you're going to get silicosis. This is something that is long-term exposure. And some of the cases they're seeing with the countertop workers where, they've been doing this for 10 years and all of a sudden they've got silicosis, they were exposed to very high amounts of silica dust in oftentimes enclosed areas inside a shop or a warehouse, grinding on these countertops, making all this dust, inhaling it like hours every day. Okay. Asbestos, kind of similar. It is another naturally occurring mineral that was very widely used for all sorts of construction materials. It was just a miracle product when they discovered this and started adding it to materials. And so it was great at sound absorption. It added a tremendous amount of tensile strength. And if you need a reminder on what tensile strength is, we add rebar to concrete to give concrete tensile strength. So you could add asbestos to anything and it would add tensile strength. It was really resistant to heat, chemical damage. It was used in everything. And then the other thing is that it mixed so well with other materials. They added it to everything in the 40s, 50s, 60s. It was just everywhere. Unfortunately, it turned out it was very, very toxic. It caused a certain type of lung cancer called mesothelioma, and there were huge lawsuits that bankrupted industries, which for good reason. That's not what I'm complaining about, but there were huge monetary consequences because of the widespread use of this material. So it's important that we are able to think about like why people would use asbestos, what some of the desirable traits were, and that would help us determine where we might find it in the house. So here's kind of a nice little chart that tells us like things around the house where we might find it. So window putty, also known as window glazing. If you have old windows, the glazing material that holds the glass inside the sash, that commonly contained asbestos because of the tensile strength it added. Roof felt, old roof felt, old shingles had asbestos. Probably by now, hopefully, all of the shingles have been torn off and thrown in the garbage that had asbestos in it. Inside the house, insulation, depending on the age of it, could contain asbestos. In flooring, there's a lot of old mastics and glues and vinyl tiles and stuff had asbestos in them. Any place you had lots of heat, like in boilers, heaters, pipes, they would use either asbestos pipes or insulation around the pipes. Insulation around electrical wiring, boards to, protect from like really hot appliances or something like that, like around a wood stove or something like that. Okay. Acoustical tiles glued to the ceiling, these were commonly containing asbestos because of the excellent sound absorption characteristics they had, and also you could make this really lightweight tile if you mixed it with asbestos because the asbestos would add a lot of tensile strength to it. The glues that were used to attach these tiles to the ceiling commonly contained asbestos. Insulation around pipes commonly contained asbestos. There used to be this bakery called Big Loaf Bakery where the co-op is now in Eureka, and I worked there when I was in high school, and there was this big oven that was basically like an entire city block long, and they would put the dough in the pans at one end of the oven, and by the time it went through the conveyor and got to the end of the oven, it was cooked. But anyway, you don't really care about that. The point of this story is on top of the oven was just loose fill asbestos insulation. Okay, they like opened up a bag of insulation and just dumped it out on top of the oven. And the entire time that stuff was just kind of blowing around in the air. Okay, so that's kind of a bummer. Any kind of heat shields, and see, this is kind of nice because this is a heat shield between a radiator and some wood framing. And this just really looks like hardy siding. Okay? It looks like cement board. That one's, when it's in that form, it's kind of easy to pick out. They used it on like wiring insulation. You know, commonly now everybody I think knows what Romex looks like. It's got that plastic yellow sheath, but if you see this kind of cloth covering on it, that's probably asbestos. The siding, again, kind of looks like hardy siding. It looks like cement board. It's kind of thin. It's like 1/8 of an inch thick, something like that. Roofing, if it looks and feels and sounds like a cement product, then it's probably asbestos. Okay, different than terracotta. Okay, terracotta is a totally separate thing, but if it looks like this, if it looks like concrete, it's probably asbestos. And then these floor tiles, and there's different dimensions of these kind of vinyl linoleum floor tiles. These things are just so hideous, but always, for whatever reason, I don't know why it is, but if they're 9 by 9, they have asbestos in them. And then the glue holding these tiles down to the floor has asbestos in it. Kind of the adhesive, it looks kind of like this black junk. Sometimes they use it to glue down carpet, glue down vinyl, stuff like that. And then this can kind of be the really dangerous stuff, because this is easy for people to say, oh, I'm going to scrape this junk up and get it out of the way, sand it down or something like that, and then you're just putting the dust everywhere. All right. So trying to identify this stuff, again, it kind of looks like cement board. It gets difficult sometimes because since it was so easily mixed with other materials, it could just be in anything. And in the 40s and 50s, particularly, that was kind of the heyday. They just put it in everything. Okay, it was this miracle product, and it was so cheap, and it was everywhere. Why not put it in everything? It's great. Okay, so that's one way you can kind of help identify it, is like dating it. Okay, if you're in a house that was built after 1980, it probably doesn't have asbestos in it. Okay, 1940 to 1980 is kind of like prime time for asbestos, and it really started scaling down in the 70s. 40s, 50s, 60s was kind of prime time for asbestos. So if you're poking around your house and you're thinking, oh, I wonder if this is asbestos or not, try and think about what are the desirable qualities of asbestos. Why would they have made this thing out of asbestos? Did they need to absorb sound? Did they need to resist heat? Okay, what were kind of the reasons they would have used it? Okay, so you've got asbestos in your house. The key term is friable asbestos, and that's when you're concerned about asbestos. And if it's friable, it means you have a material that is more than 1% asbestos and can be crushed with hand pressure. Okay, that's when it just releases a ton of dust in the air. Okay, if you've got a pipe or something like that, you can undo a pipe. They were usually kind of shorter sections, so they just kind of uncouple. You can pull that apart, and as long as you're not making dust, it's not usually a big deal. But I want to say this, and I want this to be very clear. If it's in good shape, if you can't just crush it with your bare hands, it's not raining dust on your head all the time, leave it alone. Okay? Just leave it alone. It's not going to sneak into your room at night and strangle you. Okay? If it's just in a wall, if it's under the house, if it's in the attic, just leave it alone. Okay? If for whatever reason you absolutely have to get rid of it, you've got a couple different options. If it's a small amount and you're going to take proper precautions, keep it wet, and you can probably take it out yourself. If it's a big job, if you don't know what you're doing, if you're concerned about contaminating your entire house with asbestos, you might need to have it professionally abated. There's a couple companies that do that, but this is what it looks like. Okay, they wrap everything in plastic. They're wearing Tyvek suits with positive air pressure. They're sucking air out of the building, filtering it out, pumping fresh air into the building. It is a big production, and it's pretty expensive. And unfortunately, there are some really nice buildings in Humboldt County that are falling apart and essentially uninhabitable because of a combination of asbestos and lead contamination. The amount of money it would cost to come in and abate the asbestos and the lead is not worthwhile, essentially. Okay. All right, so wrapping this all up, for the most part, you're going to encounter these in remodels and old work. Not so much with silica. Silica is in rocks. It's in concrete. It's sand. Okay, so it's all over the place. Try and date the materials. Okay, when you're talking about lead or asbestos, think about when that material was used, when it was banned, and you come up with kind of an educated guess as to whether or not it might contain that material. Think about what the purpose was. Okay, does this paint contain lead? If it's a door or a window or a floor or some stairs, then potentially, there's a good chance that it has lead in it, especially if you were able to date it, between the, kind of World War II period. It's probably lead containing. With asbestos, think about what were they using this material for? Is it insulating a pipe that would have gotten really hot? Then it probably contains asbestos if the timeline works out. If you are disrupting these materials, take appropriate precautions. And the best thing, again, is just leave this stuff alone. Okay? If you have lead paint on the outside of your house, just leave it. Paint over it. Okay? There's no reason to take it off. Okay? If it's sound, if it's stuck to the wood, leave it alone. You've got asbestos in your house. If it's not in the way, if it's not creating dust for some reason, leave it alone. Okay? Covering it up. Encapsulation is the term. Okay? If you absolutely have to work with these materials, you want to keep them wet. Okay? If you're going to be disrupting these materials, keep everything wet so that you keep the dust down. You're not putting dust into the air and dispersing dust all over the place. And then dispose of them properly. Okay? You have to take asbestos to the dump on certain hazardous waste disposal days and go through a certain hazardous waste protocol with that. And all of these things, again, if you scrape some lead paint off a window once, you're probably going to be fine. Okay? But also think about all of that paint that you're scraping or sanding or something like that is going out into the dirt, and it's going to be there forever. Okay? Take proper precautions, protect yourself, and think about everybody else too. Protect everybody else. And these health effects can be irreversible and they can be fatal. So be aware of what you're dealing with, be aware of what the purpose of these materials are, and try and kind of come up with a determination of what that material is and how to deal with that material. And I hope this helped, and be safe.